Hey everyone, today I'm going to be giving an overview of version 1 of LensNode, showing you how it works, what it can do, and what it can't do. So for those of you who don't know, I'll explain what LensNode is first. It's an OpenFX plugin for DaVinci Resolve that simulates 8 different lens characteristics at once. You can use LensNode to add a bit of lens character to any kind of footage, and it works particularly well for phone, drone, 360 or action camera footage. It simulates 8 different characteristics, and these have been linked together into lens profiles that are based on real lens tests that we have shot. These characteristics are custom shaders, not tools that Resolve already has built in. LensNode also has a few other tricks up its sleeve that you'll see throughout this video. To get some misconceptions out of the way right off the bat, LensNode doesn't replicate what a real lens does one-to-one. These effects are two-dimensional, which means they're way faster than trying to do some other type of lens simulation in 3D with ray tracing. It also means they're limited, but they have been dialed in to very closely resemble the real lens using a proprietary methodology, and as you can see here, the final result gets pretty close. So here we've got some log C3 footage from an Arri Alexa. It currently has no LUT applied to it, so it's still in log. I'm just going to go ahead and drag LensNode over to the node graph. And you'll see that the first parameter on the list here is the input color space. So what this does is it specifies the color space of the footage that you're supplying to LensNode. LensNode supports a wide variety of color spaces for use in many different workflows. So if we wanted to use LensNode in Rec 709, what we would need to do is supply it with Rec 709 footage. So what I'm going to do is go over to my LUTs and drag this Alexa log C3 to Rec 709 LUT over to the node graph. Now this is one way you could use LensNode, but because it's in Rec 709, it doesn't really have all the information from the camera to work with. So it'll look as correct as we could make it look given the data that it's being supplied with, but a better way to go about it would be to swap the order of these, and then switch LensNode to work with log C3, and then apply the LUT afterwards. That way you're giving LensNode the full dynamic range of the camera and all the color information that it needs to apply these effects correctly. So I'm just going to go through these one at a time. It's also worth noting, if you mouse over the name of the parameter, you get a little tooltip that explains a bit more about what that parameter does. So these next 3 drop-downs are how you choose your lens profile. Once you've selected a lens, I'm just going to go with the Cooke Panchro 32mm. The next parameter down the list is the master blend. If you turn it down, it reduces the overall effect, and if you turn it up, it increases it. The next one down is the overdrive. So this is a feature that allows us to exaggerate the characteristics of the lens profile. You can see that if I turn it up, you get quite a bit of coma and you start to see the chromatic aberration come through more on those highlights. I'm going to leave overdrive turned up just for demonstration purposes, so bear that in mind. The other thing we've got here is the sensor size control. So what the sensor size parameter does is it basically increases and decreases the size of an emulated sensor relative to the lens that you're simulating. So this 25mm is a rough approximation of the width of a Super 35 sensor. And since this lens is designed for Super 35 in real life, we've set the default to be 25mm. But we captured it on a full frame camera, which is 36mm in width. So if you turn it up, you can see what it would look like on a full frame camera. And if you set it to 25mm, this is more like what it would look like on a Super 35 camera. If you wanted to do, say, a Super 16 look, you could go with 12.5mm, which is a rough approximation of a Super 16 sensor size. So the next one down is the f-stop sharpener. What this does is it reduces the overall effect on the image from the center outwards, depending on how far you turn it up. I'm just going to turn a few of these up quickly, so LensNode is doing a lot to the image. You'll notice as we turn up the f-stop sharpener, the effects in the center of the image reduce down to 0. This means you can sharpen up the center of your image while still affecting the edges if that's what you want. So just below the f-stop sharpener, we've got the individual controls. These are pretty self-explanatory. They're all set to 1 by default, and there's a button at the bottom here that lets you extend the ranges. If you click that, all of these can then be turned up to 10. And if you click reset, they'll all go back to having 1 as their maximum. There's also a button here that allows you to zero them all out, so you won't see any effects and you can start from scratch and build a lens look from nothing. Just to remind you, I'm leaving overdrive on here just so that the effects are easier to see on a small screen. I'm going to extend the ranges so that these can go up to 10. If I turn distortion up, you can see it's distorting the image. This is probably a good time to note that down the bottom here in the technical settings, there's an option called scale to frame. If you turn that off, it kind of lets you see what the distortion is doing. I wouldn't recommend having this off because you can see the edges get quite stretched, but if you need to turn it off for some reason, you can. Okay, so I'm just going to reset distortion, and the next one is the coma. So if I turn that on, you can see it getting stronger around the edges there. So then we've got chromatic aberration. So if I zoom in here, I'm just going to turn the coma back off so the aberration's easier to see. There it is. Another thing that's probably worth noting is if I turn the sensor size up here, when the aberration is really intense, sometimes you can see this sort of stepping. If you go into the technical settings again, there's a setting down here called aberration max steps. If you turn that up, it can smooth that stepping out. Obviously, the higher you have this setting set, the more work the computer's doing, so it can affect performance. So I'm just going to zoom back out, reset the aberration. The next one we've got is fringing. So if I turn this on, you can see this purple fringing appearing on areas of contrast. We'll turn that back off. The next one we've got is bokeh blur. So this one blurs the edges of the image. The blur is also a bokeh-based blur, so it uses the bokeh shape from the real lens that we profiled, and the bokeh shape is convoluted around the center of the image, so each bokeh shape is pointing in towards the center, no matter which part of the image you look at. This is more like how a real lens looks when compared to a traditional lens blur. The other thing to note here with the bokeh blur is obviously some lenses have more swirliness than others in real life. This is basically due to the shape of the bokeh. So we have a creative setting down here called bokeh swirl. If I turn that up, what it does is it squishes the bokeh shape. I'm just going to zoom right in here so it's really obvious. It squishes the bokeh shape to make it more elongated, and it enhances that swirling effect. This one here is bloom. So this lens has pretty broad bloom, but depending on the lens, some of them are a little bit more like a diffusion filter. I'm just going to turn that back off. Then you've got your vignette. The default setting of 1 is going to be accurate to the lens the vignette came from. Of course, you can turn it down, but the other interesting thing here is you can turn this up and it will multiply the strength of the vignette until you kind of end up with a porthole-like effect. Let's just turn that back off. And the last one is the color cast. So if I set this to 1, that's the tint that this particular lens has. And this is based on how different the lens was versus a control lens when profiling. It's pretty subtle. If you turn it on and off, you can see it a little bit more obviously. So we're just going to reset all of these to 1 and reset the overdrive and reset the sensor size to 25mm. So this is the standard lens profile. So here's LensNode on, LensNode off, LensNode on, LensNode off. This footage was shot on ARRI Zeiss Ultra Primes, so you can see LensNode's doing a fair bit. And then if I overdrive it, this is what the overdriven version looks like. Very intense on the edges there. If I play it back, we're getting pretty decent playback speeds. So the next thing down the list is the mix and match. Let's say you wanted to use the Cooke Panchro 32mm like I have, but you don't like the coma effect. So I'm just going to turn the coma up. Here's the coma. We don't really like it. We're going to use the coma from the 40mm instead. You can see the direction of it has changed. So you can kind of build your own lens, and you can do that with as many of these as you want. So just down at the bottom here, we've got a few more settings we haven't covered. I'm just going to skip over the depth gain for now. We'll talk about that in a second. This one here, reference gamut compression. So LensNode uses ACES internally. ACES traditionally has had some issues with colors that sit outside of its gamut, causing artifacts sometimes. This reference gamut compression basically just fixes that. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. If you want to learn more, you can check out the manual for LensNode or have a look at ACES Central. It's probably not something that matters to most people, but the setting is there if you need it. And then at the bottom here, we've got bloom clipping repair. So basically what that does is it allows you to fix issues that arise with bloom sometimes when you're using certain types of log footage or linear footage with over range values. If you set it to the brightest linear value of the image, it should solve any bloom clipping problems. There's also one more setting you might encounter. As we figured out how to make our lens profiling more accurate, we've gone back and updated lens profiles to get them closer to the intended look. This setting will appear if you select a lens with more than one version, and it lets you pick older versions. It also means we can make our profiles better in the future without causing issues for people using the older versions in their current projects. We recommend you use the latest version of each profile if you can, as they're going to be the most accurate. Okay, so finally we're going to look at the depth gain. So basically, this setting won't do anything unless you have a depth map attached to LensNode. And this setting only affects how blurry the bokeh blur is. It doesn't do anything to any of the other effects. I'm just going to switch to another timeline. So here we've basically got some footage of a model with LensNode set to the correct input color space. I've selected the Helios lens. Under individual controls, everything's turned off except for the bokeh blur. And then under creative settings, we've got depth gain turned up and bokeh swirl turned up. As I said before, depth gain won't do anything unless a depth map is attached. So I've got one here that I've pre-prepared, but I'm just going to show you how to get one of those. So if you go to the effects library, search for depth map, then you can pull that in. There are lots of different ways to get depth information. If you had rendered a scene in a 3D rendering application, you could output a depth map separately. That would give you perfect depth information, and LensNode could use that to apply the blur accurately. When it's real footage, obviously we can't do that, but we can use AI with this tool to try and guess what the depth of the scene is. So the depth map basically generates a map that's black and white, and the map specifies to whatever is receiving it how much to apply an effect and to which parts of the image. So in this case, white is going to be where it applies the effect fully, black is where it won't apply it at all, and the gray values in between white and black will determine how strongly the effect is being applied. So with the depth map, there are a few parameters we can adjust in terms of finding our near and far limit. This is going to depend on the shot. I have one that I've already prepared, so we're just going to switch over to that one. And all you need to do is run the alpha output, the blue output, into the second green input on LensNode, and then switch off the depth map preview. So there are a few different ways you can use a depth map. This is just the way that I've learned to do it. As with most things in Resolve, there are a million different ways you can achieve the same thing. So now that that's connected, if we go to creative settings and we turn the depth gain up and down, you can see it's blurring the background, but it's not blurring our model here. And I've gone in and I've adjusted these settings to really get this edge looking as good as I can. At the end of the day, it's not perfect, but if I play it back, you can see it's relatively convincing. It's really up to you to determine whether this is going to work for you, and it's really, really dependent on the shot. So the other thing you can do, because this input is just looking for a black and white map, is you can run an alpha into it. Any sort of alpha that you create, which could even be a power window. The other great option here would be a magic mask. So again, this is using AI to cut the person in the foreground out. And we can see if we go into the magic mask and look, that's what I've landed on when I've tweaked all these settings. It looks like it's not very sharp, but that's what seems to look the best once the blur is being applied. Now, obviously, the more you overdrive this effect, the more problems you're potentially going to encounter in terms of getting that edge to look good. But again, it's really a shot-by-shot thing, and you need to decide for yourself whether it's worth doing. It's also worth noting that this depth map effect sort of multiplies the blur that you already have set in LensNode. So if you have the blur set to 0, then the depth gain has nothing to affect and it won't do anything. Let's take a quick look at performance. So I'm using an RTX 4090 here. This is a medium close-up of our talent on this shoot, and I've applied Filmbox to it. I'm just going to go and get LensNode and run that in Log C3. We're going to pick another one of these Pancros. We're going to do the 50mm this time. I'm going to overdrive it all the way, and I'm going to turn the sensor size up to get a bit more vignette around the edges there and a bit more of the characteristic. And then I'm going to go to individual controls, extend the ranges, absolutely crank the aberration and the coma. And then I'm going to on off this so you can see how much it's doing to the image. You can see with the film emulation that it really helps to sell the effect. I'm going to play that back. Not quite 24 frames a second, but pretty usable considering how much is being done there. I've had a few people in the comments on the last video saying they wanted to see the footage running for longer, so there you go. This is at 1080p, again on an RTX 4090. If you wanted to be doing this at 4K, you're probably going to struggle no matter what hardware you're on. We generally recommend people turn the timeline playback resolution down or edit at 1080p and then turn the resolution back up to 4K before you render. The other option would be leaving LensNode off until you get to the end of the project, then you turn it back on after setting your look and render from there. All right, so I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, check out the website for FAQs. Otherwise, reach out on Instagram at lens.node or send us an email at hello@nodemill.co, and we'll see you again soon.